Panel, an EU that stands for everything stands for absolutely nothing. We're going to hear a lot from the opposition today about how an EU imposing its will over countries might provoke a backlash. That backlash is already underway. The EU is dysfunctional and cannot implement any of the policies that it wants that would benefit the citizens that are living under it. What we're going to tell you from opening government today is that when you change this rule and to a majoritarian voting system, the EU is able to do way more things in terms of, one, protecting people whose will is being imposed on in places like Poland and Hungary, allowing more harmonization of corporate tax rates, which improves the economy and stops the race to the bottom in the EU generally, foreign policy, and also in terms of protecting migrants, all of which will benefit people's lives generally in the European Union. And because of that, we also get a better buy-in to the EU on our side of the house, and so win both of those clashes. First of all, a bit of framing. So why are there many significant majorities amongst EU countries who want to do good things, but there is not a complete majority, not a complete unanimity, so those good things are not being done? Because there is a lot of diversity amongst countries in the EU, and people have different interests, or politicians who are in power have different ideological views. There might be a lot of people who think it would be good if we protected migrants coming from overseas, but there could be one country who didn't think that would be the case, so that policy is not implemented. For example, Ireland does not want to harmonise corporate tax rate because that would not benefit them, even though, as we will tell you, that will benefit the whole of the EU generally and leads to greater buy-in. When we change this rule and we allow a majoritarian voting system, we allow more things to happen that most people in the EU want and will benefit those people's lives. And because of that, and people would see that happening, people would buy in more to the institution as a whole. So, what are some examples of where this could benefit people's lives if we change the rule? Places like Poland and Hungary, there are authoritarian leaders leading those places who do things like restrict the freedoms of the press, impose totalitarian policing regimens, and do court packing. So there is literally no checks and balances on what they are allowed to do. They are making people's lives hellish in those countries and are not allowing them to freely make the decisions about what their leaders are trying to do. How would the EU be able to make people's lives in these countries better? If we changed to a majoritarian voting system, now Poland and Hungary would not be allowed to vote against laws which would restrict their own funding because they are not abiding by the EU's regulations as they are currently doing under the current voting system. So if the EU says, we want to restrict your funding because you are not allowing a free press in your country, which is making it easier for you to retain power and do bad things to people in your country, they can just vote against that regulation themselves or ask Poland to do it for them because there is this unanimous need. If we change that, the majority of people will restrict Poland or Hungary's funding until they change their behavior so that they allow a free press. They don't impose such strict regulations on people's lives and they get less authoritarian. Furthermore, it sends a message to countries in the EU who are veering in that direction, like Italy, so that if you do start restricting the free press, if you do start packing the courts to entrench your own power and make these anti-democratic changes so there is no real opposition to you within your own country and people do not have a free choice, we will cut off your funding so that you will have less money to improve people's lives and make your own political chances less good because people's lives are worse off. No. What is another way that the EU can improve people's lives they're not doing currently? I think harmonization of corporate tax rates is something that is really important here. So currently, you can set whatever corporate tax rate you want in the EU. You can allow. So, for example, Ireland sets a really low corporate tax rate. That means that every other country in the EU has to also go lower and lower, because if they don't go that low, no multinational corporations are going to want to come to your country because it is so expensive for them to operate there. When the EU harmonizes that corporate tax rate, yes, it might be bad for the country who sets the lowest rate and is attracting the most investment, but it is good for the EU generally, because when it is harmonized, no one has to go as low, so that you can collect more tax revenues generally that you can spend on things like making education systems better for your people, having better hospitals so that people have a nicer end to life and that injuries or pain is not as bad for those people. It also means like things like in your own country, if you can set your own regulations on workers' rights, you might just let them get more and more lax so you can attract Amazon or other of these big firms who want to go to places where they don't have such strict red tape to go through to protect their own workers. If you harmonize that, you make workers' lives better because there isn't this race to the bottom in terms of those regulations anymore. That is good for everyone in the EU. Foreign policy. Currently, there are some countries in the EU who don't care a lot about war or building an EU army because they have a history of neutrality, such as Ireland or other countries like that. That means that there is not this unipolar international relations framework or whatever. So now that Russia is building in its own power and is on the EU's doorstep, because we need every country in the EU to support an EU standing army, we are not getting that. If we change the regulation, there is a majority in the EU who will support that. Why is that good? Because it means that Russia's not scared of the Estonian army, it's not scared of the Latvian army or whatever it may be. It is imposing its will more and more in those people. The people in those countries are scared of Russia and are more likely to align with Russia because they know the terrible force that could come upon them if they do not. If you have an EU army, Russia is more scared, more likely to back off and not infringe on those people's lives and impose its own rule over those people, even if they do not want it. It makes citizens' lives in those countries on the border with Russia easier for them because they're not scared on a day-to-day basis. Last of all, migrants. Currently, there's a majority in the EU who want to protect migrants' rights because it is a catastrophic humanitarian crisis where people are literally dying on ships trying to make it to Europe. Obviously, not every country wants it because more countries have bear the burden more than others, such as Greece, because everyone is landing on their doorstep rather than France or Germany or whatever it may be. If we change to a majoritarian voting system, we get greater protection of those migrants' rights so that people are no longer dying in the sea. Generally, we have told you why. If the EU does this, the EU is able to be legitimate and do the stuff that it wants to do rather than be dysfunctional. That not only improves people's lives, but actually makes the people realize the EU is worthwhile and you get greater by it. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I welcome the Leader of Opposition here.
I want to make clear that the EU at this juncture cannot afford to turn countries away from it, to turn countries which are currently either ambivalent or believing in its potential, to Poland misbehaving and doing authoritarian incursions. These were already punished, their rights were already suspended via the ECJ, okay? So there are actually lots of existing mechanisms by which you can punish like basic incursions of like basic EU values that are uncontroversial and that everyone agreed to, like the independence of the judiciary that Hungary and Poland attacked. But secondly, the policy, firstly, I'm not sure that actually enters the remit of the European Council. It's largely already taken care of in the worst examples they pointed out. But secondly, the other policy example they bring is stuff like tax harmonization. Look, if anything, no reason why it is that those are the kinds of policies under consideration in the first place, cutting funding to Poland included. Why are these being considered? I'm just not sure. There's no structural reason why those are the kinds of things that are being considered. But secondly, tax harmonization, if anything, objections to it, valid ones by Ireland, valid ones by other parties, are more likely to be voiced in the first place because they have weight in the voting system, because they cannot just be pushed out by the majority of powers who see tax harmonization as in their favor. So those objections are never made made in the first place, and they do not carry weight, and they do not even have a chance at swaying the discussion or a chance at maybe improving the policy before the House. So that actually harms the very people that they think should have a voice. Right, let's talk then about proving why it is that this motion exacerbates divisions that already kind of exist under the status quo, but we think that unanimous system at best appeases and at worst contains to an extent. So it's true to say that by and large there is a rift between the Western European countries and Eastern European countries because some of their interests diverge, because the way in which they perceive each other does not always correspond favorably, because they join the EU at different times, so feel different levels of gravitas. As a result of this, I think it's actually crucial that you maintain a system where Eastern European feels valued in a forum that is crucial. So this is about, for example, the basic fact of knowing that your vote matters and your vote actually has the capacity to block an entire policy, but equally has the capacity to pass another policy as part of a unified critical mass. That is crucial, firstly, optically, because it says to Eastern European countries that they are valued via their vote, that they are of equal importance in this forum as the other members, no matter their difference in economic status. This means they are far less likely to feel shut out. The problem with majority systems is that powerful countries or countries for whom the policy would play in their favor, whilst perhaps costing other countries more, might band together very easily and strategize. But the thing is, they might not even bother to address or cater to the countries which incur the high cost of that policy. So as a result, exclusion and misunderstanding is actually inherent to their side of the house, because there are no incentives to look at everyone's interests and ensure they are catered to or compensated for to an extent, because we think even in our side, even if policies that aren't great do get passed, they at least have caveats to compensate for the worst harms to sidelined members. And so we think that it's not just about the vote, but it's the creation of incentive to consult those countries which are unhappy with the policy placed before the House. We think the notion of legitimacy and buy-in serves the unity of the EU, and it serves under the state at the present point in time to fend off the threat from Eurosceptic parties. Firstly, because of outside perception, because now you see a forum, for example, from the perspective of Ukraine, where all voices are valued, where Eastern European neighbours can have a say, can influence the way, can influence the process. But secondly, we think internal perception matters as well, because we think at this point the resurgence of fragile pro-EU forces are still weak enough that they require bolstering, and that any conversion of, say, European countries towards the skeptical camp and in favor of the populists that are currently still running the show to an extent, I think is a sufficient tipping point to mean that the EU's unity could be under threat, that any notion of legitimacy that is fragilely being rebuilt could actually be backlashed again, could be checked, could be stopped. So as a result, this is a time where turning more voices away from European Union's legitimacy is actually crucial to could actually tip it into near oblivion. But secondly, we say that the basic efficacy of the policies and projects that are passed require the full body of support. So we think a plausible policy that's being considered are sanctions against Russia. The problem with sanctions is that they require an extremely high bar to work. Implementing this policy, where it is only approved by the majority and disapproved of by Eastern European, means that implementation is partial at best. So the basic efficacy of those sanctions does not even work in the first place. But moreover, it's not about ineffectiveness, it's also about the harm this creates, because this now says to those Eastern European countries that their voices do not matter and that they are not worth persuading in the first place. On our side, we say even if the sanctions aren't passed in the first place, we say those sanctions are brought up again, but next time they're better mechanized. Next time and they are more accommodating of the countries that are skeptical or that are hurt by it. We say this process of repetition gives countries time to win the skeptics around and time to mechanize these policies to be more reasonable, to be more generous, and to be more concretely mech'd out. So proud to oppose.
I welcome the leader of opposition for that fine speech, and I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
A European Union which can't even stop the backsliding of democracy in Poland and Hungary, make the countries within it function reasonably well, is not only a complete waste of time and pointless, it also completely undermines its legitimacy and support for it, because a European Union which never delivers benefits to people is what actually leads to dissatisfaction and frustration with it, not one that overreaches in the way that OO claim. A few things in this speech. Firstly, just some direct responses to them. Then I want to do some rebuttal and some weighing on who gets more buy-in to the European Union. And then I want to revisit the benefits we brought, which were largely unengaged with the last speaker. The first thing they say is that generally there's a West versus East divide in the European Union. So over time you will frustrate the side which loses out. This is not the case. Support for different policies that we talk about absolutely vary substantially on issue to issue. Just look at the things that we told you. On Ireland, on taxation and harmonisation economically, it would be countries like Ireland or that would be on one side versus the others. On things like migrants, it is the South who are the most impacted. In terms like authoritarianism, it's basically just Hungary and Poland versus literally the rest of the European Union. There was no analysis in their speech in why, in general, it would generally be one group against the other. We think what is more likely is that depending on the issue, you will have some people are in the majority one day, some people are in the majority the next day. So that deals with that analysis. I think that's also important to note in terms of legitimacy, because I think people are much more willing to support a policy which might be inconvenient for them or they perceive as not being in their interest if they then think they can get a policy in the future. Currently, when you can never achieve anything because you are never willing to compromise in the first place, because it is so unlikely that you will get unanimity at any stage in the future, you think, well, why should I bother sacrificing this thing when I'm not going to get any benefit from it? The second thing we hear is that it requires full support to implement European Union policies. The example they give is the single market, where this is like sanctions, where this is just obviously not the case. The European Union, arguably the most important thing in it is the single market and the idea that you have free trade within it. So obviously if one country was implementing sanctions on Russia and another country wasn't, that would completely undermine it. So it is completely unacceptable and never done that countries have different tariffs or sanctions or whatever on countries, because that is something that is foundational to the functioning of the European Union, and countries are never allowed to do that. That also ignores the fact that on our side of the house we actually have mechanisms to force countries to comply with them. What do they have when they can never do anything because they need unanimity? So the country you're trying to punish can just stop it, or they can have one ally that can stop it. So we can actually say, if you don't implement these sanctions, we're going to substantially remove your funding or something like that. That's something they can never do. In terms of then weighing this sort of backlash thing, I just want to highlight a few things which I've kind of already said. The first thing is the thing about you will get your way on more issues as well. So that is something which means that it leads to more people buying in, because it's not the same people winning or losing each time. The second thing is just generally, when you see a European Union which is functional and you can actually see a point to and benefits from, you are more likely to subscribe to it and realise that it is something that is important. The last thing I want to say here is I'm really unclear what the harm of this backlash is on their side of the house. Look at all the enormous benefits we brought you in our speech in terms of economic benefits, in terms of stopping the backsliding of democracies, foreign policy, migrants. These are just enormous benefits, and some countries getting a bit pissed off I don't think outweighs this. So we think that we win on that clash, but it's also much less important than the good things we can do on our side of the house. I'll take back half now if they have something.
I mean, I don't think that this institution really has power of a corporation tax. We're trying to get a treaty change for that. So, like, I don't think all of that particular part of the argument is really in this debate.
I mean, we can get into weird territory in terms of who determines what or whatever. But the European Council, like on issue taxation, is currently seen as a very important issue, and that's why nationalities have jurisdiction over it. So that's why the European Council is the one who determines it. So that's why it is in the debate. The next thing then they say is that the ECJ can like do stuff to be like Hungary, like stop doing that, or Poland or whatever. But as I highlighted, this is completely meaningless because there's no mechanism to enforce that. So they just completely ignore that ruling and it has no actual power at all, whereas we have that power on our side of the house. They then like their only response to any of our analysis on the benefits of this was just to say that, give an example of saying tax is not something that is currently under consideration, and we gave no explanation as to why it would be something that would be. Firstly, our explanation for why it would be something that would be was that it would benefit the European Union. Why would you not do something that would benefit you? So if this is going to lead to substantially more tax revenue being collected, then it's probably something the European Union is considering. But secondly, it just is. It's something that like Macron and Merkel regularly talk about and criticise countries like Ireland for. So they just haven't been like reading the news, I think, enough, to be honest. So I just want to add some stuff on foreign policy here in the last bit of time. So we talked about like Russia and why it's important in tackling them, but it's also important in a number of other ways. I think firstly, just for things like humanitarian work, where you generally need like peacekeepers or military, we think that the European Union tend to have a very good reputation as people who are fair and support democracy and human rights in ways that countries like the United States don't. And you need a very, very large army in terms to intervene in this kind of way in countries like Yemen or whatever to help in that way. Secondly, I think the sanctions thing is actually a very clear benefit on our side of the house, because they can never do sanctions on their side of the house because it's unlikely they would get the majority, the unanimity, and you need it by the European Council because of the single market thing. So that just means that countries can like Saudi Arabia or whatever can continue to act with impunity, and particularly when it's the case that America is unwilling to solve them. At the end of this debate, there is just an enormous amount of good that the European Union could be doing, both for itself and the world, that it currently isn't because of its dysfunctional structure. We get those benefits on our side of the house, and we also get more buy-in. Very happy to propose.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that point, and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to here.
Yes, thank you.
I would suggest putting pens in your paper. It might fly away. It happens in a few debates.
Sorry about that. To the extent that some of these decisions already come under the European Parliament, where majoritarianism is a thing, if it were true that the majority wanted a lot of these good things, like tax harmonisations, like sharing the burden of migrants, presumably they'd already voted it in to some extent. It's unclear, therefore, to us why it is, A, that even if they are right, that the European Council does have control over these decisions, that the majority would necessarily vote for these good things, or at least have shown us no systematic reasons why that would happen. But third of all, like, even if they're correct on these things, note they've never shown how exactly you can enforce these kind of decisions. But fourthly, why we think that in the context of Euroscepticism, you are going to push these countries, particularly the Eastern European and more authoritarian countries, to leave the EU and or seek closer ties with Russia. We think if we buy that's a harmful thing, and in terms of anti-democratic, that's the greatest harm in this debate. But moreover, it's also to do with the EU survival, right? So bear in mind that all the benefits are contingent on these countries staying within the EU, and you'd be able to enforce those kinds of things. It would therefore show you that the countries are likely to move away from the EU, even if not immediately, in the long run. All that falls down. So first of all, like in terms of just basic responses, right? I think can I just point out usefully that why a lot of the decision-making they talk about probably falls outside of the European Council. And the info slide says foreign policy, rights for EU citizens, like suspending current EU nations. We think those kinds of things in terms of tax harmonization aren't really included. But secondly, they've given no reason to buy why the majority necessarily votes for these kinds of things. Now, in terms of things like tax harmonization, there's probably an interest of a number of countries, for example, who do currently benefit from generally lower tax rates. No, it's not just Ireland, but probably a bunch of other countries as well, who probably have an interest, for example, not voting for tax harmonization, or the notion that tax harmonization does attract more interest, or it's, for example, the calculation of the future rights being taken away in terms of economic policy, in terms of tax, right? I think all these reasons are why they don't necessarily vote in the majority. But thirdly, right, even if these countries do vote in majority, even though they've given no reason for you to believe that they will, I point out that they themselves acknowledge that the enforcement mechanisms are incredibly limited, right? In the sense that, the only thing they can say is you threaten to remove funding, but one, I would point out that the threat can only be one-off, in the sense that you make that threat and you have to kind of follow through to that threat, because if you don't follow through by removing funding, then you can't really threaten them again to do that, but also once you've removed it, you can't do anything else after that point. But second of all, we've pointed out that a lot of member states themselves have interest in not seeing these things like a suspension of member states' rights or suspension of funding, because they themselves may feel that at some point, if they violate certain rules, that they themselves may subject to it. Bear in mind that often cases, even Western European states, in some cases, do not follow through or implement all of the things that the EU wants, because they see it's much more convenient on the ground to not implement those rules. For example, in terms of Italy and its rules in terms of product quality, right? So we often say that member states themselves don't want this enforcement to happen. But thirdly, right, if you do actually enforce these things, and bear in mind, we think these authoritarian governments still want sources of funding in some form or another, they're probably going to seek those sources of funding from other places, be it China or Russia, and try to get funding from there, even if it happens covertly, right? So we think all the harms they want to talk about actually magnify on their side of house, to the point at which they start to rely increasingly more on authoritarian governments themselves and move away from the EU's source of influence. Why then is the notion of discussion and negotiation and getting this unanimous vote important? One, I think it's just prima facie a notion that your vote is valuable, right? That you can make a decision, and if you choose not to exercise that vote, or you choose to vote otherwise, that makes a difference as to whether the decision is passed. But secondly, right, I think it also means that that the other member states that do want this vote to pass actually engage in negotiation. It's, for example, try to find ways in which they can modify this current policy of vote in a way that benefits this nation, or can convince them to do things. It's, for example, trying to actually do some horse trading or even negotiation as to why it might be better for them to pass this unanimously. The problem with the dictatorship for the majority, if it does exist, is one that's probably largely controlled by Western Europe, controlled by France and Germany. You can convince the states that are most close to them to vote in a specific way. We think that's problematic at a point at which the interests of those Western states are not taken into account. Nobody ever wants to talk about migrant rights. Bear in mind, those kinds of things exclusively affect the Balkans right now, who are, numerically speaking, the minority of countries in a situation where France and Germany themselves don't want to have to take in migrants, like many other countries that are not involved in like Northern Europe also don't want to take on migrants. So we think on those cases, actually there's no interest to want to change these kinds of things for the better, right? Crucially, right, and at the point at which you have unanimity, is you force that negotiation to happen in the first thing we think that's very important. Closing, what's your extension?
We think that just because currently the council isn't dealing with economics, this is more because foreign policy is the only thing that can get through here, because Germany will always be it. Can you actually explain why economics are not going to be dealt with by the council?
I mean, that's what the info slide says, but also point out that if we're talking about issues that are quite important in terms of the EU's survival, so foreign policy and its relationship with Russia is probably more important, you have to defend why those things are currently being dealt or will be dealt with under the European Council. So in terms of Russia, right, if the whole end point of the idea is that we don't want authoritarianism, we don't want Russia being involved in these situations. Look, I think it is well understood that a lot of European and Baltic states are generally, like, historically and geographically close to Russia, and in the context where they increasingly feel screwed over by the Western Europe and EU, there's increasing growth of Eurosceptic or pro-Russia parties or pro-China parties that are being elected at the point which they felt shut out of the European Council. Bear in mind, a situation where they felt they can make the most important decisions within the status quo because that's where the most crucial decisions are made, I think represents a sort of tipping point for them. I think it represents a point at which they feel that if I cannot have any sort of real influence over these kinds of important decisions that do affect my relationship with Russia, that do affect, for example, my fundamental rights as a country and to access to funding and even my basic survival within the EU, I think is a point which they do actively turn away. And even if they don't leave the EU, they also have more incentives to actively sabotage decisions made by those Western countries if they can, right? I think it's a situation where efficacy actually goes down. The last thing opening government want to talk about is the creation of things like an EU army and protection. Note that once, NATO really exists in the status quo, and bear in mind, a lot of EU states are already part of NATO, so all that notion of protection against Russia already exists. But secondly, right, the stationing of NATO troops within your country and within, often cases, those countries bordering Russia itself causes tension. It results in things like skirmishes, the killing of civilians, right? Often cases, to avoid these issues and to avoid infuriating Russia, states themselves do not join NATO and do not join NATO. For example, Finland is unwilling to do that because it shares a border with Russia and doesn't want to piss it off. I think the point where you do want to create things like an EU army to stand against Russia is the point where these states leave en masse because they cannot risk any sort of conflict with Russia, cannot risk being seen as openly antagonistic to that interest. Look, at the end of the day, the EU's legitimacy is important, right? Because just on its basic claim to represent Europe and bring political and economic stability and all for those economic benefits to exist. So at the point where you see members leave as a result of this, you undermine the EU's basic point of existence, but you're also not able to do those kinds of things they want to talk about. At the point at which these states, even if they don't explicitly leave, but move closer to Russian and China influence, and therefore are more likely to sabotage those kinds of democratic decisions they care so much about, you also undermine the benefits they want to bring about as a result of majoritarian voting. You don't get those benefits, you don't get them enforced. Please oppose.
I would like to thank everyone, Minister, the leader of the opposition, and the member of the
guys ready? Do a few things in the speech. I'm going to talk about how we get better discussion of policy in the long term and the formation of kind of like European identity. Secondly, I'm going to talk about like immigration and how that like affects countries, whether it's Poland or Serbia outside the EU, and that aspect of this. And then finally, if I have time, I'm going to like add some extra stuff to what we've already heard from our opening. Okay, so moving on. So some rebuttal. So firstly, we hear this idea that status quo doesn't really benefit Eastern Europe. Like, probably true, but like it's a marginal change. So like if we're making it worse for Eastern Europe, that's even worse, right? That's the whole point of debating. Secondly, this idea of like German hegemony, right? That Germany is hegemonic in the EU, and like this is how these votes are going to go. Like, firstly, we just think it's like incredibly unlikely that like Germany is the one vetoing all these decisions, right? We think that generally, like, Germany tends to be very progressive. It tends to have a lot of, like, economic and social rights. We think it tends to focus a lot on those kinds of things. But also, we just think that, like, often, like, it's richer, it has more great capacity to lobby other countries and get its own way. It has the media fame of its leaders. It has, like, perception across nations, across the whole of Europe, that its leaders are important and they're able to, like, work with other leaders better. It has, like, bigger populations, and so, like, a country like Belgium doesn't necessarily want to upset Germany and so forth. So we think, like, Germany is able to get its own way. It has like experience of working through EU institutions. So we think on their side of the debate, actually, it's when it engages in the lobbying, when it actually like engages in backroom deals with like only getting that qualified majority. That is like when it's able to like, you know, really exert its influence, because that is when it's able to use its political capital and sway to get its say. On our side of the house, you only take one country to do that, and therefore it doesn't require any political capital. It doesn't require anything like that. You just say like, I'm opposed to that, and so you just oppose it, right? Secondly, we just think like the sorts of policies they're talking about just aren't really that in this debate, right? So like the European Council doesn't have say on the Eurozone, right? That and austerity policies. That's the ECB and other institutions within the Eurozone. Not all EU countries are part of the Eurozone, so they have different institutions, right? Like the UK and so forth. Secondly, like the welfare policies themselves, like so the way the EU citizens' rights stuff works is it defines what a national government has to give to EU citizens that's equal to their own domestic citizens, right? So that means that you have to give the same welfare benefits in particular cases to a Polish citizen in the UK and vice versa, right? It's not that like the EU is now granting extra money to the citizens of like Eastern Europe, right, when they give them more rights. It's that the Eastern European countries would have to pay more money themselves to migrants that come to those countries, and therefore they're less likely to vote for those kinds of things themselves. Germany's fine with those things because Germany like supports generally progressive kinds of ideas. It's more conservative countries that are opposed to that. Then we get this idea. No, I'm going to move on. So how are we getting better discussion of policy? Firstly, as I've told you, like the networking, the ways that you only need to get that majority on board, and therefore the ways that political capital kind of functions within the EU is therefore like the discussion that you need to like get other countries on board. It becomes less because you don't have to like lobby every single all of the 28 countries to get them on board. You only have to lobby 14 or 15, right? That is like the crucial aspect of that. So you just have to spend less money like doing those things. It's like it becomes much more efficient to do that. But secondly, there's lobbying in terms of private lobbying, right? That's to say that if you're a private business and you want your decisions to be done by the EU, you now only have to lobby again like 14 or 15 countries rather than all 28 countries to get them on board with decision making. That means that the decision making of the EU becomes much more exclusive. It becomes much more not just focused on particular countries, but also just focused on particular needs of those with the largest political capital within the EU, including the biggest businesses. That means the needs of the EU across are likely to be not looked down upon, like in terms of EU-wide kinds of needs, right? So it's not like going to be sort of like just focusing only on Germany. It's also just going to be focusing on like big German businesses or big French businesses and so forth. What is the impact of this? It means you get like over the long term, like lazy discussions where the policies are rammed through. You don't have to listen to countries like Poland and so forth in the first place, and therefore they're more likely to take a skeptical view because they don't even have the diplomatic channels there in the first place. You don't invest in your foreign service in Poland if you don't need Poland on board to like vote things through on the EU Council, right? That is how things change. That is how you get more Euroscepticism, because you don't even have those connections in that way. You're more likely to increase centralization of power within the EU, and therefore the accountability and the changes that are being made are less decided by the average citizen, and the average citizen has less say on those decisions. Finally, you get less assurance on the clash on like Russia. You give somewhere like Russia like less assurance, right? Because they don't see like a country like Poland or Serbia or whatever inside the EU and able to like take on board Russian interests in those discussions. And therefore that is when you get like the little green men come into places like Ukraine. That is when they send those people across the border and threaten the peaceful institutions there. It's when Russia doesn't see that its own interests are being represented within the EU fairly because they see themselves not as like cackling evil people, but like wanting to protect their own security. Now, how does immigration come into this debate? Note that this applies both to Poland and Hungary if they are being pushed further and further out of the EU, but also applies to countries like Serbia wanting them to join the EU as well. We think, firstly, that immigration brings cultural knowledge. You exchange ideas as you move across countries, you understand the more liberal fabric that's going on in different countries, and you come back to your own country and provide those ideas or talk to your family and friends about actually how access to gay people or other minorities is actually okay and acceptable. So you need to have those liberal visas that the EU provides in order, well, not visas, but like completely liberal, like free movement, in order to like allow those cultural connections to occur and exchange national identity and form European identity. Secondly, you need to have low capital controls, which the EU provides, because that means that you have foreign investment. That means that the ties when high-skilled people with liberal ideas come to places like Poland and like meet other Polish people and explain kinds of different things and provide different ideas about how to function in that kind of way and improve fragile institutions. You're able to bring that outside expertise in. You're also able to bring in like outside media organizations to scrutinize governments like Hungary and Poland. Why is that important? It's important because if they're unable to like bring capital from outside because it's high capital controls and you get a massive tax by bringing money into the country, then as a media organization, that means you can put less journalists on the ground in those countries. So as you push those countries further and further outside of the EU, or you threaten the amount of investment going into those countries because OG wants to cut off investment to places like Poland, then that means those institutions have less reason to go there because they have less money and capital. We think that like inside the EU, like this is bad, but it's also the perceptions of the EU, the perceptions that the EU is not there for you. And we think that is how you change over the long term EU cultural identity. We think that it's that formation of like cross-cultural exchange is the formation of ideas like that and how you improve fragile institutions. Note that we think that countries like Serbia joining the EU is incredibly important in this debate, not just because like it improves the EU in some kind of way, but also because they're the most vulnerable countries in any part of Europe, right? They have the most fragile institutions. They have to make the biggest sacrifices to reform themselves to become part of the EU, and therefore we think that on that metric, that in getting them to join is also incredibly important. All those reasons.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that and welcome the proposition if you're here.
All good? Okay. A lot of this debate has been about the extent to which people buy into the EU. I think that across all teams, only Hannah tells you why the immediate effect on people's quality of life is likely to be the factor that changes whether they buy into the EU or whether they don't. And that is why I think CG is probably taking this debate. So, let's start with the opposition bench and what I think OO tells us. I think we get three main things that come out of opening up. The first of these is they tell us that policies like this probably increase East-West division and Euroscepticism. I think there's a couple main problems with that. Firstly, there's a considerable amount of clash with what Hannah has to tell you, given that only she gives us the mech as to why not doing this is likely to cause economic damage, and why economic impacts on an individual person's life are the thing that are likely to change their opinion the most. I think when you have the ability to do things like prevent German hegemony, because there is more equal representation, I think that means, as Hannah tells you, that smaller states can club together and lobby for better policies. This is probably more likely to happen simply because that's the thing people care about most, right? They don't care about relatively high-level decisions they probably will never hear much about. They care about the immediate impact and how that changes their lives. This is the reason why things like far-right parties tend to depend on saying the EU is harming our free trade, the EU is harming our exports, right? Because that's the thing that directly impacts someone's life, and that's why I think probably won that clash. Secondly, though, they claim that the decision making is the more important thing because it's optical. However, I think a lot of this goes for the same reasons as I've just told you. But additionally, I think the fact is that these people probably care way less about the likelihood of voting than they do the ability to lobby for their own interests. When you are a group of smaller states and you can no longer be vetoed by a policy that Germany doesn't want to pass, I think that makes you more likely to lobby for things in your own interests. Secondly then, opening opposition tells us these policies are only efficient with full support. However, I think the comparative they give you is quite a false one, right? If these policies require unanimous support to pass under their side of the House, I think that often means that they don't pass at all. At that point, if sanctions are being put in place, they are only being done by individual countries without discussion or cooperation throughout the EU on how to do them. So what that means is that the alternative is probably that if it's passed by a majority, that majority of countries is not only doing it, but cooperating and talking about how to do it. Even if some aren't then necessarily doing it, that probably means it happens at all, which is, I think, better than what they propose. Furthermore, their case is entirely unclear on why this doesn't mean that people don't propose more palatable policies in the first place to make sure that they do work. Surely the thing that most people want is to increase the efficiency with their work and to make sure they have the most buy-in by applying that pressure. I think at least when some countries do it, that probably wins on even the metric they provide us with, given that the alternative is it not getting passed or being done nation by nation without cooperation. Lastly, they say that this means you can't do things like enforce policies, and they cite things like funding and you can seek people elsewhere. However, what I think they don't acknowledge is the fact that the EU isn't explicitly just based on the euro and whether or not you get money from the central EU, right? The reason countries typically are in the EU is because they care about things like having free trade within its borders, they care about having things like access to the euro that is supported by wealthier nations. I think the countries are quite unlikely to do things like look to Russia or China at the point when they lose out on all those benefits. So I'm not sure what they say about countries being likely to leave the EU is especially true at that point. In a minute. I think they also probably want things like diplomatic backing of the bigger and more democratic nations, as they're unlikely to gain when they do something like leave the EU. At that point, they lose things like inter-nation cooperation, which is particularly important for smaller EU nations that can never really hold their own against somewhere so economically dominant, as Russia or China. Opening?
Sure. What is good for Eastern European economies is not what is good for Western European economies. So even if Germany cannot veto economic issues, does not mean the policies you like will pass.
I think that seems quite unlikely at the point where the policies we're currently talking about are not the ones that places like Germany don't want passed, but the ones it does, right? When they have the ability to pass something that helps them, given it's been predominantly focused until now on what benefits the Western Europe, and Eastern Europe's been quite largely ignored, right? Because they don't have that sway, given the fact that Germany has a veto, I think that makes all the difference. Even if it's not a significant amount of more policies that pass, I think that's probably more important in the long term because it is far more and helps balance out what we've seen in the status quo. So I think that doesn't really interact, especially at the point where Hannah gives you the real reasons for buy-in, tells us why this means that economic policy isn't dominated by a German hegemony, and also means that we get things like a more comprehensive foreign policy that makes Europe more of an effective trade bloc. I think that's vitally important because that's what people care about when they think about the EU. So then to have a little bit of a look at closing opposition. I think closing opposition has a couple of things to say. Firstly, they again talk about Euroscepticism, they then talk about centralisation and a couple of things like that. However, I think what they have to say about Euroscepticism is never very responsive, right? Hannah tells you that if you can guarantee something like welfare as a right passed through the council, that means that the ECB can't do things like continue policies of austerity. And so if you do something like that, that means these countries are more likely to have that buy-in, given the alternative they've seen existing. So I think even if that's only true for, even if what they say is true for some policies, it's not the case for policies that affect places like Poland the most, right? Recognise that current policies being passed prioritise the nations which are biggest because they effectively have a veto. So I think if you do things like this, that probably means that we realistically win the buy-in clash on our side of the house. I think a lot of what they said about pushing countries out and threatening investment is relatively similar to OO, so I think at the point where we tell you why the EU is not exclusively based on things like this, we probably win that clash furthermore. Lastly, we get a tiny little bit about the perception of the EU. However, again, I think that's largely contingent on what Hannah tells you about the qualities of people's lives, not the very high-up decision-making. So EU identity is likely determined far more by what people think the direct effect on them is, and whether their country is able to lobby for things, as opposed to anything that bench has told us. I think what Hannah does then is ultimately has proved to you precisely why this increases buy-in, because it like changes the methodology of what people care about. It means that Germany no longer has the ability to veto policies simply because they prefer different nations over Germany alone, which is what's happened in the past and realistically needs something to make up for it. So lastly then, why I think we take it over our opening. Firstly, I think Hannah engages more about things like reasons for Euroscepticism. She tells us why this kind of policy is likely at the point where people are able to lobby for things like having a welfare budget as a right. Furthermore, she tells us why we're likely to decrease scepticism, and her mechanisms on the quality of life prove far more why the average person cares and therefore why they buy into the European Union. Secondly then, I think this is probably the far more likely method of individual buy-in than something like defending the vulnerable or taking in migrants. I think what she does is assures us that we have long-term buy-in to the EU to ensure that we can continue doing these kinds of things in future. I think the things that OG talk about are, while very true, unfortunately somewhat more short-termist and don't consider what people actually care about in their decision to consider themselves an EU citizen or somebody who cares about this kind of thing in the EU. I think what Hannah ultimately has done is told you the precise reasons why people buy into the EU and why this is likely to happen when we change the focus of the EU onto nations that have largely been ignored in the status quo. Continuing to do this perpetuates German hegemony. That is really bad for nations who suffer at the point at which economic policy benefits places like France and Germany alone. People need to see economic benefits in order to have buy-in. Without that, I think the EU fails. Please vote CG.
Alright, thanks for giving that time speech. Now I'll be the opposition whip to close the debate.
Oh, right, pens and... yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to tell you why on our side of the house you get greater benefits for the most vulnerable groups that we have talked about this debate. Notice that Alex is focused specifically on the most vulnerable people. So first I'm going to explain why that makes us better than our opening half, and then I'm going to go through every team and explain why we've beaten them on all of the clashes that they've put out. So first, why are we better and different than our OO? First, we have this, Alex provides us mechanisms for how we impact immigration. He shows us that, if we have a long-term formation of an EU national identity, we're more able to then have better relationships with migrants within different countries. For instance, in countries where you have ethnic minorities from outside of the EU, you're more likely to be able to help them, give them the aid they deserve, because you're creating this sense that we are all one, we are all part of the same EU identity. Notice as well that we get more scrutiny of weak institutions, right? Because we learn from foreigners about how government is perceived. So that means that at the point that you're allowing yourself to be able to get more of those interactions, you're able to then get different opinions on how your government is seen and what the situation in those individual governments are. So that means you get greater scrutiny and greater accountability, not only to those migrants themselves who are most vulnerable people, but also to everyone else. Now, also, we've proven why you're likely to get... we've proven why these decisions are likely to get worse, better than our O has. Because, unlike what CEO would like to believe that right now we have a German
Germany has the power to veto and so on. Notice that we've given you specific examples of how like Germany can lobby as well. Germany has the political capital to get other countries on board. So this doesn't change on their side of the house. Like the decisions are still made worse on our side, because it means that now Germany can if any bad policies that it may want to any bad policies that it may want to pass, they can just talk to less people rather than talking to 28 countries. They just have to negotiate with 14, and as a result that you're able to then have greater harm. You're able to you cause those greater harms that they wanted to talk about. Now, notice as well that this means that we get more big businesses buying into this lobbying power, because now we allow them to be able to lobby different governments, lobby different countries to get the policies that they want to pass. Notice that this directly clashes with open and half anything that they've liked to say about economics and so on. At the point that you're giving more power to these big companies to lobby for things that are harmful, it means that harmful because they don't have the interest of the citizens. They have the interest of profit making. They have the interest of their own wealth, and as a result you give them more power as well. So why are we maybe after? Okay, I'm going to move on to CO with this idea of Euroscepticism. That we get this idea that it rises because countries like Germany are able to have veto power. Notice that what is the alternative? On their side, it means that Germany still has political capital to be able to lobby and get past the things that they want. But now those smaller countries like Serbia and so on, smaller countries are not able to have the same amount, right? Notice that Serbia is specifically important because it probably doesn't want to join the EU because it still wants to have ties with Russia, because they're still quite close by. It has fragile systems of democracy, which means that if they want to get into the EU, the process of changing those systems can be really hard. You lose the incentive of wanting to join the EU if you now think you don't have the power to influence any policy, or any policy that might harm you, you don't have the power to go against it. So that means that you no longer join the EU, and that means that you no longer build those networks with Russia, who perhaps want to see it as a threat, and they want to be able to deal with that. So notice as well that Serbia is more important than what OG focuses on, which is Poland, because we have poorer people, right? The system of democracy is much more fragile than places that are already in the EU. So getting Serbia in the EU means that they get more investment, they're able to get more FDI, they're able to get more of that scrutiny from outside eyes going into there. That means that they're more likely to be able to liberalize or progress, as well as install a better rule of law, because these are also part of the requirements that they have to change in order to join in the first place. So it's important even on their own metric. Now, I'll take you now.
If you can guarantee as a council given rights, the ECB leaders must rotate between all nations rather than just Germany and France, why will the ECB not work more fairly?
I think we've already given you reasons why the ECB isn't necessarily directly linked to the council. There are other members of the zone that are also part of the ECB. So the policies that ideas that they're trying to give you don't really apply in that case, or become less important. The issues that are more important are issues of immigration, issues of getting Serbia new members coming in. Now let me move on to sorry. Yeah. Okay, so we get this idea that you get better democracy, but I think Alex has given you enough reasons to show you that there's no actual change, in the sense that you're able to lobby for less numbers of countries, and it means that those smaller countries who are minorities, who understand best what the needs of their people are now completely excluded from the discussion. It doesn't lead to a better democracy because the discussions reduce. It means that you're no longer willing to talk to everybody and convince everybody of your point. Instead, you just focus on a few countries that you think you can get them to make that 14 or 15 majority. Now,
on like creating a national identity to stand up against Russia and so on, notice that we get that more on our side at the point that we get more buy-in from like smaller countries, not just the big ones, because they feel like they are getting something back by going into the EU.